And our last panel will be about frozen assets. This is one of the most important subjects that we are discussing, and we are willing to get them all, not just the interest rates. So let us check what the speakers are thinking about. So I would like to invite to the stage the moderator of this panel, the Ambassador John Herbst, Director, Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, who will introduce the speakers. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Pardon me as I check my brain. The first person is coming with us virtually, Iryna Mudra, who is a deputy head of the presidential office at Bankova. So she'll be coming up on screen, I think, any second. Thanks, Dan. Okay, and then we have Sir William Browder, the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Then we have Artem Shevalyev, the alternate board director at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then we have, last but by no means least, Yulia Ziskina, who's a senior legal fellow at ASIM. Clearly a fan favorite. Okay. Before I ask Ms. Mudra my first question, I just want to point out, so there's no confusion, this panel is about frozen Russian state assets, not Russian oligarch assets. And this is important for two reasons. One, the big money is on the Russian state assets, 350 million, at least as best we can tell, as best we can tell. But also, going after private assets is more difficult legally than going after the state assets. So this is where the big money is for the present time. We'll get to the other money, which will be bigger than we think, later. All right. With that as an intro comment, let me find my questions. Here we are. Here we go. Ms. Mudra, as you know, it took years, literally years, and I remember talking to you at the very early time of this, to persuade the G7 states to permit Ukraine to use the frozen Russian state assets. The Biden administration finally took up this issue and was successful in persuading its partners to give Ukraine a loan of $50 billion with the $350 billion of frozen state assets as collateral. Have you received the money? And what are you looking to do now with the remainder of the assets? What is the impact of that money? And what are you looking to do with the remainder of the assets?
Good day to all participants of the forum from Kiev. I thank the organizer, the moderator, for this opportunity to present Ukraine's position on such a vital issue. The 50 billion loan.
Actually, we're having trouble hearing you. You're coming in distorted.
We checked before, there was a good sound.
Oh, it's good now. Continue. Please,
now it's okay.
please start from the beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Not her fault.
Good day to all participants of the forum from Kiev. Again, some trouble, right? Well, the 50 billion loan was an important but provisional measure. As of now, we have received only 4 billion out of the 50 under the ERA loan mechanism. And while it is supposed to provide us with funding for 2025, in terms of international politics, the biggest problem about it was that it did not make Russia pay. The money was provided by G7 at the expense of the taxpayers of these countries. Russian money remains intact and Russia has not paid for the damage it has caused to Ukraine, to Ukrainians, to businesses, Both G7 and UN, through a resolution supported by 94 states, which was adopted back in November 2022, have confirmed that Russia must pay for the damage caused by its illegal war of aggression through an international compensation mechanism. The relevant legal infrastructure for this international compensation mechanism has already been prepared. We launched an international register of damage, which is located now in The Hague last year, and are now finalizing the implementation of the next stage, the creation of the Claims Commission. There is a clear legal position supported by the world's best leading international law professors that transfer of Russian state or sovereign funds to an international compensation mechanism to be used to compensate Ukraine and other affected parties for the injuries caused by Russian Federation by its unlawful war of aggression would be a lawful, proportionate, reversible, and justified countermeasure, which all states are entitled to participate in. Therefore, the answer is simple. The Ukraine's position on it has not changed. These assets must be transferred through an international compensation mechanism to Ukraine. This money will be transparently and efficiently used to enable our military and economic survival, our reconstruction, and the compensation of damages for victims. It will allow us to buy the weapons we need to continue our defense and the equipment we need for our reconstruction from you. It will allow us to rebuild our infrastructure, to launch the investment opportunities. And we will return homes to our families, heal our wounded, and support our people forced to flee from occupation. We often hear that transferring Russian assets presents a risk to the Western economies. This is not the case. Any negative effects would have already been triggered when the G7 states froze Russian assets and stated that they would not be transferred back to Russia until Russia paid. And once again, we have strong economic analysis from the world's best economists on this point to prove that. What will hurt the Western economies, as well as the prospects of a sustainable peace, is returning this money to Russia or allowing Putin to end this war on his terms. Just imagine that $300 billion euro would do for Russia. It would be like a giant Western bailout of their war debt. Emboldened and now rich, Russia would only increase its military spending. So we call our partners to take a next step and transfer this money for the recovery, for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and as the compensation to the victims of this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that full answer. Mr. Browder, you were a successful investor in Russia before being unjustly driven out by the authorities, and you know well the financial system there and its political side. What has been the impact in Russia, one, of the original freezing of the assets, two, the $15 billion loan, and what would be the impact if the decision was taken to transfer the remaining $300 billion to Russia? To Ukraine.
So the $300 billion is a lot of money, and in a certain way, in my opinion, one of the reasons that Putin felt confident starting the war was he had a war chest, and that war chest was around $650 billion. And by immobilizing that money on day one, we immediately made his war chest half as big. which I think is helpful. We've seen now, as the war drags on, that they've had to draw down their rainy day sovereign wealth fund. I think it's 2/3 depleted because they haven't had this money. But most importantly, what Putin has been banking on since the beginning of this war is that Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine. Russia has much greater wealth than Ukraine. Russia has more people than Ukraine. Russia has more military hardware than Ukraine. And Putin thought it would be an easy invasion because of this enormous advantage. And what Putin discovered was, first of all, the brave Ukrainian soldiers fighting back with everything they had. But the thing that's probably surprised Putin the most was that this enormous economic and military advantage was nullified by the Western support. And the Western support has been unprecedented. It's been extremely helpful for Ukraine. But Putin has always been of the opinion that the West will tire out of continuing to fund the war. And that's where this $300 billion comes in, because Putin is not doing well right now. Putin's economy is on the ropes. He's got 21% in interest rates. He's got super high inflation. They're basically having to borrow money. Every corporation in Russia is required to lend money to the military war effort. And so Putin has got a sort of timing problem. And so what Putin has been hoping for is that the West gets worn out from spending the money to support Ukraine. And to a certain extent, Putin's calculus has been correct. We've seen lots of rhetoric in the US election criticizing the funding of the war. And so this is the easy answer. This is the most obvious answer, which is if this money is confiscated and given for the defense of Ukraine, then Ukraine has a clear runway, a very long runway, to continue to defend itself. And the huge economic disparity that Russia has, that Ukraine doesn't have money, disappears. And so, and I would argue, when people talk about what's the single most important thing that could happen right now for Ukraine, it's absolutely obvious to me, it's this $300 billion. Everything else is secondary. If this $300 billion is confiscated, this then gives Ukraine an opportunity to win. If the $300 billion isn't confiscated, then what happens? At some point, the West is going to run out of patience and money for Ukraine. We saw what happened in January of last year when the US delayed the approval of the $50 billion military aid package, and the people on the front line almost ran out of ammunition. If this money is not released, at some point, the money is going to dry up, Ukraine is going to run out of ammunition, and Russia will win the war. And so this, in my mind, is the single determinant of whether Ukraine fails or succeeds. And there's a lot of people who are saying, well, you know, there's legal complications and so on and so forth. And these are people in Europe. If they say that, I would say, well, how about thinking about what would happen if Ukraine fails, if the Russians end up moving into Ukraine? What's going to happen? There's going to be 15 million Ukrainian refugees fanning out across Europe. What happens next? Putin makes a move on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Western governments have to increase their defense spending from 2% to 5% of GDP, not to mention all the other costs. And so this is the obvious thing to save Ukraine. This is the obvious thing to save Europe from a refugee crisis, and it's the obvious thing to save the integrity of the rest of the countries which are also threatened.
Thank you. A very complete answer. Mr. Chevalier, what has been the role and assessment of the EBRD and the other international financial institutions regarding the decision of the $50 billion loan to Ukraine?
Thank you, Ambassador. And well, let me start by saying that it seems to be $300 billion is a lot of money, but frankly, a single child's life is not worth this money, and we've seen, unfortunately, thousands and tens of thousands of tragic deaths caused by Putin and Russian soldiers in Ukraine. But we still have to do what we have to do. The IFIs are playing an important role, although admittedly it has been the key economies, the G7 economies, that had to work together to make the 50 billion ERA package available. It is our colleagues from the World Bank who are now absolutely essential in channeling these funds, making them available for the Ukrainian budget. EBRD, being more a private sector focused or project focused institution, is standing ready to finance the specific reconstruction projects in Ukraine. We will be using some of the funds that may be available through ERA, but we do prefer to see these funds being used for essential needs of the Ukrainian public finances, to finance, first of all, social and military expenditure, of course, making sure that our armed forces do have the weapons available to deal with the Russian invasion and to cause as much damage as they can. But it is also essential to understand that 300 billion, which we'll talk about, and we'll hear what are the modalities that we can still have use of these 300 billion, but it's important to remember that the actual ticket is much bigger. The damage that Russia has caused already in Ukraine, I don't know, take a wild pick. The last RDNA study by the World Bank was, I think, just under $500 billion, $500 billion. As far as I understand, the World Bank is coming up with the next iteration of assessment. I don't have privy to the number, but I'm guessing clearly it only goes up. It's probably approaching $1 trillion. Look, these are enormous numbers. Ukraine will need these funds to support. It's absolutely clear that it should not come from Western taxpayers. The 300 billion, let's approach it as a done deal. I know it's not, but this will then help key decision makers to put into a thinking pattern of how to extract more funds from Russia to finance Ukrainian reconstruction and Ukrainian rearmament going forward. I think we should be talking about reparation taxes, reparation levies, reparation sanctions, tariffs, the word that President Trump used yesterday, and we'll try to, we need to work together to also make sure that there are substantial funds coming after the 300 billion.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Ziskina, you've been an intellectual leader in the fight for getting access to these frozen Russian assets. You know every phase of this legal and then political struggle. The Biden team did an excellent job in getting the $15 billion loan done when they decided to head on this in the spring of last year. And then in the last couple of months, they began to talk about the other $300 billion. How do you assess the struggle over time and the prospects for getting access to $300 billion?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Well, let me start by saying the circumstances around these assets have actually completely changed. To that end, I'm going to dispel a very common myth that you regularly hear, one that I've even heard throughout this past week at panels here, upstairs, perpetuated by very well-meaning people. And that myth is that almost all the assets are held in Europe by Euroclear, which is a securities depository in Belgium. And the implication there is that, well, since Europe has been resistant, it's therefore somehow meaningless for other countries to act on the assets. False. Actually, about 90% of the Russian reserves are now held in cash in banks around the world. So you can see in this diagram here, when the funds were first immobilized, most of the Russian state assets were held in debt securities through Euroclear. Almost all of the securities have now turned into cash. This shift means that the assets are now subject to the jurisdictions of the countries that issue that currency. So let me explain how that works. When Euroclear manages securities that the central bank has invested into foreign reserves, it has to go through correspondent banks in the country that issued that currency. So for instance, managing the Russian assets that are denominated in US dollars, for instance, Euroclear has to go through US correspondent banks in the US financial system. When securities, like government bonds, mature into cash, typically what happens is that the correspondent bank would either pay out that cash through Euroclear back to the Central Bank of Russia, or they would be instructed by the central bank to reinvest them. But because of asset freezes, they're prevented from doing either of those things. So what we have now is a giant frozen accumulation of cash in local correspondent banks with no guidance on how to manage them or what to do with it. Euroclear actually publishes its quarterly reports, so we can look at these figures directly on Euroclear's site. It holds a total of 176 billion of Russian state assets that are now in cash. This pie chart here. 65% are denominated in euro, but 35% are in non-euro currencies like global pound sterling, Canadian dollars, USD, Australian dollars, and Singapore dollars. So in other words, jurisdiction is actually currency-based. It is not a physical location because the assets are not physical assets. If you add that up, as well as the amounts that are held directly in those countries, at least 105 billion to 126 billion of the frozen Russian central bank funds are actually under the jurisdiction of countries outside of the EU. That is roughly about 40%, if not more, of the total frozen Russian reserves. I actually just published a report in the New Lines Institute with Philip Zelikow from Stanford University, Martin Sandbu from the Financial Times, Jameson Firestone from the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, that lays out probably the most detailed accounting of the distribution of these Russian assets. So if you'd like a copy, please find me afterwards. But because these cash assets are now within the jurisdiction of these countries, national governments can use existing laws, existing bank regulation powers, foreign affairs powers, emergency executive powers to regulate and then transfer the funds into an international trust fund to hold and manage that Russian cash on behalf of Ukraine and to use for Ukrainian victims. So there are only two lawful places this money can go: to Russia itself, or to Ukraine, or it stays frozen until what the West has said, Russia pays, something that no one actually on God's green earth thinks that it will voluntarily do, given that it has never, in its entire history of illegal conquest and imperialism, ever paid reparations, and it's not going to start now. So the question really isn't whether Russia will pay, the question is when, and when we will make Russia pay. We already have the precedent, we already have the legal foundation, and really what government officials need to do is make the decision to finally use it, and they are in the best position now to do that.
Ms. Mudra, there are news reports that the Trump administration is looking favorably on using the remaining $300 billion in frozen assets in some fashion for Ukraine. Has anyone from the Trump team been in touch with Ukraine on this issue? And what is Ukraine intending to do next?
Well, actually, I can't comment on particular confidential negotiations, but
I understand.
overall, our position very much aligns with the agenda of President Trump, securing peace through strength and making the world safe again. So keeping the money frozen has not succeeded in achieving this goal and in achieving peace. Returning this money to Russia will not only embolden and strengthen Russia, it will embolden every other regime that is considering a war of conquest. It will also leave Ukraine uncompensated, unable to defend itself, and unable to rebuild. None of this is in the interest of G7 or European Union or a stable world. So transferring this money for Ukraine's defense, reconstruction, and compensation will send Russia several important signals. First, Russia isn't getting a 300 billion bailout. Russia's economy is under serious strain. If Putin realizes this money isn't returning, he will be encouraged to make peace more quickly before those strains put pressure on his regime. Putin's belief that he will have the funds to outlast our partners' support is one of the key drivers of prolonging the war. Second, our partners are ready to support Ukraine and the post-World War II world order. Compensation for damage is not negotiable. It will be paid now from the funds at hand. Third, that it has been far too costly to ever do something like that again, that the West is not weak and is actually ready to stand up to aggressors. This is peace through strength. The outcome of our war will determine the future vulnerability to similar attacks. It will also determine whether other dictators will see wars of conquest as viable options. Justice and accountability are key to ensuring future peace and stability in Europe and in the whole world. I cannot overstate the urgency of this issue. This is a top priority for Ukraine right now. We are continuing negotiations with all relevant stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic. And we kindly ask you to support us in this, raise awareness, engage the policymakers, speak out loud, build up pressure. This has to be done, and it is in everyone's interest. We must not let the fear of action to paralyze us and to allow for the worst possible outcome to happen. Collapse of Ukraine will destroy European security and plunge the world into chaos. If the step is not followed, then the aggressor will understand that it's possible to continue to destroy international law and unity and achieve its goals without paying a price.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Mr. Browder, your thoughts on the Trump administration acting on this would be welcome. But also, you know well the economic situation in Russia. The wartime economy, Putin's wartime economy, is facing strong headwinds. Inflation in well into double digits, interest rates at 20%, indications that Russian major firms may be going bankrupt. There's a lively debate as to whether their economy will crash this year or next. We would appreciate your thoughts on this, and again, on Russian and Trump's intentions.
Well, I mean, I think the only thing that matters right now in the short term are Trump's intentions, and it's been a nerve-wracking transition because we have heard two different types of things coming out of the Trump camp. On one side, we heard what I would consider to be sort of very reasonable thoughts from the National Security Advisor Waltz, from the Special Envoy General Kellogg, from Marco Rubio, and on the other side, we've heard sort of insane things coming from Tucker Carlson, from J.D. Vance, and from Donald Trump Jr., all very insulting towards Zelensky, all insulting towards Ukraine, and nobody really knows. So where does Trump stand in this whole thing? You know, how is he going to figure this thing out? And I don't have an answer. We're sort of 2.5 days into the Trump administration. But what I would say is something interesting, which is that there was sort of the contours of a peace deal that was laid out by Trump's proxies over the last month or two, where they discussed various different ideas about where the war zone would end, and NATO membership, and foreign peacekeepers. But all that stuff, and I'm sure all of you read these stories, and I'm sure all of you have thought about it, and I'm sure some of you find that the contours of these proposals offensive. Some people perhaps not. But what's interesting is all of these conversations have taken place in back rooms in which the participants haven't included Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin actually is not interested in any deal of any sort. Vladimir Putin is interested in total victory, and I know this, and everybody knows this, that his entire position has been a position of a maximalist. His position has been that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore, and he's never in the entire time of the war, even after they've had 800,000 casualties, even after they've lost enormous amounts of equipment and money, he's never altered one step from this position. And in my own personal conflict with Putin, which has been going on for more than 15 years, I've never known him to compromise, negotiate, or in any way back down. His whole modus operandi is to double down, to bluff, doesn't matter how bad his hand is, and to just continue to escalate. Therefore, it's my feeling that whatever Trump wants, whatever his team wants in terms of the contour of a deal, Putin has no interest whatsoever in accepting that. And what we've seen in the last 48 hours, and this may change, but what we've seen is that Trump has said 2 days ago, and these are very, very small sound bites, and so we have to extrapolate from very small sound bites, but Trump has said that President Zelensky is ready to negotiate. So Trump has said, I want a negotiation. President Zelensky is ready to negotiate. And he said, I'm not sure if Putin is ready to negotiate. And then he's gone on to say that Putin has lost a lot of men and he has a terrible economy. That's what he said 2 days ago. And then what he said yesterday, which was quite remarkable, and it actually gave me a pretty strong feeling of confidence, is that after sort of a strange preamble trying to show his friendship towards Putin, he then said, if Putin doesn't negotiate, doesn't come to the table, then there's going to be taxes, tariffs, and sanctions. And in my opinion, based on what I know about Putin, he is not going to negotiate. And therefore, there will be taxes, tariffs, and sanctions. And there may very well be more military aid. And if I have an opportunity to pitch Trump, I'm going to say to him, listen, if you don't want to give American money to Ukraine for military support, grab the $300 billion. And as a deal maker, the art of the deal, isn't that the smart thing to do? And so I'm hoping it goes in that direction. I don't want to project too far into the future because it's a total unknown, but I feel a lot better today than I did 3 days ago.
I think everyone in this room shares that feeling. Okay, Mr. Shivalyev, as someone who works who's at the EBRD, how do you and the bank look at the possibility of transferring the remaining $300 billion to Ukraine?
Well, as I said, it's absolutely essential to make sure that there is an efficient channel or vehicle to make the $300 billion available for Ukraine.
But no institutional objections or reservations is what I want.
No, not really. Look, there are. Let's be very clear from the financier's point of view. It's a lot of money. You need to make sure that they're efficiently managed. It's not like something you can say, Ukraine, here's a pot of $300 billion, make use of that, right? We need to make sure that, we need advanced weapon systems. We need to be able to finance our military expenditure and our social expenditure. We need to make sure that we can finance the budget deficit. But again, we are talking about amount of money that is probably even bigger than the immediate needs. So we need to make sure that these, first of all, again, first things first, I'm looking at Yulia here. We have to make sure that the work that has been done, the funds have been allocated, the funds have been incapacitated, right? What's the right legal term to use? Now let's make sure that Ukraine has an instrument to have access to those funds. It's subject to the G7 and Ukrainian government to negotiate. I can only call for that to happen really, really fast because we need to make sure that we can deploy those funds in Ukraine as soon as possible. Again, first of all, to ensure weapon supply. But having said that, we shouldn't forget the other important point, the tariffs, the sanctions, the additional levies to be taxed on Russian trade. it's not only about a fair outcome or making sure that Ukraine has access to those additional funds. It's also about making sure that the Ukrainian allies globally benefit, because imposing additional sanctions on Russian oil trade will reshape global energy markets, will make sure that other players like the United States, someone else in the world, will get a bigger share at the cost of Russia's share. And that's good, because that will make sure that markets are more transparent, more efficient. Similar goes to the fertilizer markets. Similar goes to food markets. So again, being very, very strict on sanctions, on tariffs, on Russian trade going forward, and when I say being strict, I mean stricter than we are today, will make sure that we do have additional funding available for Ukraine, but we also make sure that the markets are more efficient and Ukrainian allies do get a share of the benefits.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Ziskina, you and Razum have been very active in this campaign for years now. Are you in touch with the new administration on this question, and what do you hope to accomplish this year?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Yes, the administration has made it clear that it wants Russia to end the war. The only thing that will get Putin to do that is to eliminate his hopes of being able to continue the war and stay in power. The only way to do that is to transfer the funds into an international fund for Ukraine, eliminating the hope that Putin will get some sort of Western bailout, as Ms. Iryna Mudra said, and to make him realize that the West is no longer afraid of its own economic power to fight dictators. That is the way to actually achieve peace through strength. So to that end, there are several steps for this administration and for other governments to take. The first is transparency. So we've talked about Russian state assets held in other jurisdictions through Euroclear, but that's really only one part of the story. So the Russian central bank also holds some of its funds in foreign reserve currencies directly with other countries. For example, an additional proportion of Russian state assets denominated in US dollars are held directly in US financial institutions, so not through Euroclear. So there's two buckets of money. No country, except Switzerland, surprisingly, has formally disclosed the total Russian assets in its jurisdiction. We can only piece together this information through Euroclear's public data and through cross-referencing news reports. For example, let's use the US again. In the US, despite the US Repo Act requiring the Biden administration to have publicly disclosed the total Russian assets in its jurisdiction, the Treasury Department only reported the $5 billion held directly. And it kept the total amount of Russian state assets, which, as we already know, includes the $14 billion held through correspondent banks in Euroclear, confidential, classified. It provided no rationale for this decision, despite it being clearly against the spirit of the law. So this is something we hope that the current administration would fix. But by keeping these assets shrouded in secrecy, as governments are doing, governments are absolving themselves of responsibility over them. The result is that the public pays taxes to support Ukraine's defense efforts, while at the same time, governments are keeping secret the scale of dirty Russian money within their countries. This secrecy benefits nobody except Russia. And it also makes it easier to circulate this talking point that, well, all of the reserves are in Europe. But let me be very, very clear. To circulate that talking point is to circulate a Russian narrative. Russia specifically moved its assets into Euroclear right before its full-scale invasion as a way of a safe harbor for its wealth and to escape international justice over its assets. And by keeping that information hidden and the assets locked away and frozen, we are playing directly into Putin's hand. Disclosure is the first step towards accountability, but the next step is initiative. So far, the strategy has been to unanimously align the G7 and the EU. There are two options now. Europe needs to wake up and realize that it is on them to hold the line, but waiting on that will paralyze the rest of us. So what we really need is a coalition of willing nations to take decisive action on these assets. And that can happen now. For example, the US, Canada, and the UK have all signaled their support for transferring the assets. And together, if you calculate this up, that's about $70 to $90 billion, and which is about 30% of the total funds. By forming this coalition of the willing, countries can set an example for the rest to follow. But somebody needs to take that first step, and that is what has been missing for the past 3 years. The way to ensure that these assets don't go back to Russia is not through press statements, fancy press statements through the G7 about pledging to keep the assets frozen until Russia pays, which is really the equivalent of a pinky promise. When it's become clear that governments change, political situations change, and it is possible that these assets can be unfrozen. So the only way to shift the burden and to ensure that Russia is held accountable for the first time in history is to erase Putin's hopes and transfer the assets into this international trust fund for Ukraine, where they can be managed effectively and distributed according to transparent, credible, and agreed upon guidelines for Ukraine.
Thank you. A wonderful thing to work on. Okay, we have maybe 10 plus minutes left. I know we have audience questions. I think we know we got a question over here.
Thanks. So, okay. I'll start. Lisa Yasko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine, and also author of a resolution in the Council of Europe about sanctions to fight Russian aggression. And we've passed a number of the documents on the frozen assets. And my question is, what do you think would be that legal calls and instruments that are still needed? I've heard one about disclosure, about the number of these assets, but what else law could do to help this all happen? So please give these advice so that we can put this into the resolutions.
Sure. I can take that. I can take that question. So yes, disclosure is the first part. That does not need any new legal mechanisms. To transfer the funds themselves into an escrow account also likely does not need new legal mechanisms, as countries already have enforcement powers. They have foreign affairs powers, they have emergency executive powers. But to the extent that they don't, it is possible to create that legislation, as we've seen with the US Repo Act, which specifically authorizes the use of countermeasures, as Iryna Mudra said, to transfer the assets into first a domestic account and then into an international trust fund. But the first thing that really needs to happen, and this can happen honestly tomorrow, is for banks to use their regulatory powers to separate the sanctioned funds that Euroclear holds on behalf of the Central Bank of Russia from its non-sanctioned funds. That way, we get a clear accounting of them. But in terms of legislation, if you do need legislation, then it has to be through an act of state. So through the executive branch or the legislative branch, and not through a judicial mechanism, which would invoke issues of sovereign immunity. So that's a fairly simple way to do it.
Can I just very quickly add to that? Why is this absolutely essential? These money, when moved to the independently run trust accounts, they will actually earn interest. Now it's very basic that it will generate tremendous amount of additional funding, then again, will then be available to Ukraine. And the other point on disclosure, not specifically related to the 300 million, but that the governments can work, is to make their own corporates disclose their operations in Russia.
Yes.
Specifically for listed companies.
Yes.
I think this is a topic that is not getting enough attention, but I think it's absolutely essential that we make international companies that still operate in Russia disclose that they do.
Catherine Valinga. So I really have 3 different questions. John, it has to be done. So Bill, no, actually, Yulia. June, we have the G7 summit in Canada, which is one of those coalition of the willing. We have Italy with the recovery conference for Ukraine. So are you saying that we could conceivably have $90 billion that could be in a fund before those summits actually happen? Can that be done? Second question. I spoke to the Prime Minister of Belgium today, and I said to him, I gave him this information, and I asked him to please show support. And he said to me, there is nothing that I can do if the international community tells me to transfer those funds, then we will do it. So is this real, Bill? Because you have worked with these, governments to enact legislation, parliaments, like how do we get them to act? And finally, Artem, will the banks give up? If Bank of Canada, for example, has $20 billion on their accounts, will they actually give those up, or do they really just want to hang on to them at the end of the day?
Let me follow up.
Okay.
Okay, let me...
Okay.
I'll take your first question. In short, yes, this can happen. This can happen before July. The legal mechanisms are, again, in place. All that really is needed is political will. We got the $50 billion loan done in record time because the urgent need was there. There is urgent need for this, too. The urgent need is to get Russia to stop its war. To get Russia to stop its war is to remove these assets from Putin's control. So that is the crux. That is the political will that we need, and it can theoretically happen before the G7 annual meeting and the recovery conference.
No.
So, three questions. So this is not a legal issue. This is not a sovereignty issue. This is an issue, a very plain, as Yulia just said, it's purely an issue of leadership and political will. And we haven't had the international leadership. Nobody has taken the mantle of this thing and gone around and said, we have to get this done. Everybody is sort of looking to everybody else. Nobody wants to do this unless everybody else does this. And in order to get something done, and we've seen the same thing with weapons and all sorts of other things, it requires somebody to step in and do that. Who is that going to be? Maybe it's Donald Trump. Maybe it's the new Chancellor of Germany after their elections. Maybe it's Keir Starmer. Maybe it's Emmanuel Macron. I don't know. Somebody has to step in and say, enough is enough. This has to happen. Let's get it done. And until that happens, it could be years or it could happen in 2 weeks, but it requires political will.
A simple answer, it's not the bank's money. It has always been, it's been clients' money before, then it may be now sitting in some kind of an extraordinary account. It doesn't, it's an accounting issue. It's not an issue of capital adequacy or something like that.
Just to make more on Bill's point, you've had, as Yulia mentioned, 3 countries that leaning in this direction, the US, the UK, and Canada. But Biden only got serious on this April or May of last year, and that's how you got the $50 billion. They show real leadership then. If Trump decides he wants to get this done, it'll get done. And the laggard countries, we're talking now about France, Germany, Japan, and Italy, will come along. Okay, Eurasia, and then Anders.
Thanks, John. Larissa Lutseva, Chatham House. If Trump decides to have it done, Trump said the golden age of America begins. Does that mean also golden age for dollar? Will Trump think that going this way you're suggesting will undermine the dollar? Do we know his advisors and economic team? What would they advise Trump? Thank you.
Let me take that. If everybody does it, and if the dollar does it, the euro does it, the sterling does it, the Swiss franc does it, and the Japanese yen does it, there's no golden age for anybody, or there's no bad age for anybody. one of the big arguments is we can't do this because we don't want to weaken our currency. But the question is, where are Saudi oil revenues going to be accumulated? They're not going to accumulate in the BRICS currency. They're not going to accumulate in Iranian rials or Argentine pesos. There's no other reserve currencies in the world. They're not going to do it in Bitcoin or Trump coin. They're going to do it in the currencies that currently exist. And so I don't think that that's an issue.
No, that was great, Bill. There's really nowhere else for them to go. Countries don't hold their money with the West because they're friends with the West or they like us. They do it because there's nowhere else and it's profitable. That's all that there is.
Okay, Anders, you're up. But before you speak, here's a gentleman who's done a great deal of positive work on this issue.
I wanted to pick up on your point, Julia, that it's only Russia that benefits. No, the banks benefit. A bit more than a decade ago, Stuart Eisenstadt made a big study of Jewish money in the Swiss banks, and he found an enormous amount. And the Swiss banks had hidden it to their own benefit. And in your report, you show that this Russian money is now completely unmanaged. Banks love such money. So you need to attack the private banks, not the central banks, because this is what they love doing. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Okay.
Good evening. It was a really inspiring panel. I have a question for Julia and I think for everyone else. Have you considered the potential role for the United Nations in this effort? Because you've been talking about not necessarily issues of sovereignty, but it's more of not being able to have one country necessarily champion the issue. Do you think the UN could play that role?
Well, the UN has already played a very crucial role in passing a resolution in November 2022 calling upon the establishment of an international compensation mechanism and that Russia must bear the burden of financing its damage. However, the Security Council is the primary mechanism through which to enforce these kinds of decisions. But we don't have the power of the Security Council because the aggressor sits on it. And this is where countermeasures come in.
Sorry, as a follow-up, I don't have the microphone. Of course, I wasn't talking. Sorry. No, definitely. That's without taking the Security Council's mandate into account, because of course the veto power that is part of its functioning would not make this possible. I'm talking about UN organizations that have supported similar efforts in the past for other countries that could play a role in championing the international support from various countries. That's my, could be possibility. Consider it.
Join the cause. If the UN wants to step up and do it, that would be most welcome. But so far, that has not happened.
I'd be slightly reluctant. First, because UN is actually charging for its services on almost every single front, from refugees support to healthcare distribution, and those fees are not exactly minimal. I'd rather keep those money for the Ukrainian needs. So, and secondly, there have been mechanisms before. I think there was a case with the Iranian funds that were channeled through Bank of England. It worked. I'm not suggesting that's the case, but I mean, there have been precedents without the use of UN.
Okay, Ms. Mudra, since you were not on the screen in front of me, I've neglected you. Feel free to answer this question or any previous question.
Right. I would like to touch upon the last question. And as Julia rightly mentioned, UN already stepped in, acknowledging the necessity to create the international compensation mechanism. And in this, we follow the historical example of UNCC, United Nations Claims Commission, which was created after Iraq-Kuwait invasion. So the model of the Claims Commission, which should also include the compensation fund, exactly taken from the model of UNCC. Almost more than 50 states are taking participation in the working out of this international compensation mechanism. And this mechanism consists of three main components. Register of damage is already in place. Claims Commission, it is under the development. and compensation fund. So this is the third element which should be created, but it will take time. For the Claims Commission, it will take almost 1 year to create. Before first we have to have at place the legal documents for that, and we are working on the international treaty. But this international treaty would have to be ratified, so it will take time. So the idea is that before it happens, before this Claims Commission is established, and within the framework of this Claims Commission, the compensation fund is established, we could use any of the existing or to create a new one trust fund and to accumulate money in this trust fund, awaiting the work of the compensation of the Claims Commission, because it will be the body which will adjudicate claims from the register of damage and award compensation. And this body will be a globally supported legal instrument, because on this we have more than 50 countries working on this. So we believe that there is no need to apply to the UN for any other resolutions or support of this mechanism, because they already made a word on this. And now the members who voted for this resolution are working to have this infrastructure established and being operated. Thank you.
Okay, this has been a terrific panel. We're already 8 minutes over time, so we have to cut it off here. Let's give applause to the folks who really gave you some great ideas for stuff to do next.